The air at Willow Hill Cemetery was thick with the quiet murmurs of mourners, their voices carried away by the gentle afternoon breeze. Friends, family, and acquaintances had gathered around a polished casket, paying their final respects to James Whitmore, a man widely revered for his charitable work and warm presence in the community. His name was etched in elegant script on a black marble headstone, beneath an inscription that read, "A life of service and sacrifice." Most of the attendees whispered about his philanthropy, his kindness, and his generosity, all the things they thought had defined his life. But none of them knew the whole story. At the edge of the gathering, a woman stood in silence, her deep green dress flowing modestly around her. Her silver hair was neatly tucked beneath a simple hat, and she clutched a single red rose in her hands. Unlike the others, she did not engage in hushed conversations, nor did anyone acknowledge her presence. She wasn't part of their world, though her presence commanded attention. It wasn't until the pastor concluded his final prayer that she stepped forward. The crunch of gravel beneath her heels was the only sound as the mourners parted, watching her with curiosity. Who was she? And how could she claim such a deep connection to the man they all thought they knew? She stopped in front of the casket, her gaze lingering for a moment before carefully placing the rose atop the polished wood. Then she turned to face the crowd, her expression calm yet resolute. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew James better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Faces turned toward one another, brows furrowed, whispers spreading like wildfire. Who was this woman? And how could she stand here among James' closest loved ones and make such a claim? Eleanor's gaze swept over them, calm yet unshakable. "Before today ends, you'll understand why I'm here," she said. "And you'll understand the James Whitmore that most of you never knew." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The crowd quieted, and for the first time, they listened. Eleanor took a breath, her voice carrying a calm authority that made it impossible to look away. "I met James nearly 50 years ago," she began, her eyes distant, as if watching the memories play before her. "But not in this town, not in this life you all knew him for." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. "It was in Montgomery, Alabama, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this," she continued. "James was just a young man then, full of fire and ambition. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was in the civil rights movement." The crowd leaned in slightly, the weight of her words settling in. "That's where we crossed paths," she said, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "On the steps of a church where we were organizing sit-ins, James wasn't afraid to stand beside me even when it meant losing his job, his safety, and the future he had planned." Gasps rippled through the group. The James Whitmore they had known was a philanthropist, a kind-hearted giver. But none of them had ever heard of this. None of them knew he had risked everything for a cause that could have cost him his life. Eleanor let the weight of her words settle before pressing on. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice," she said, her voice softening. "We were more than that. We were family." A hush fell over the crowd. "When my sister was taken from me by the violence of those times, James was there," Eleanor continued. "When he lost his job for standing on the front lines of change, I was there for him. We rebuilt each other." Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat, her gaze fixed on the casket. "He called me his sister in every way that mattered," she said, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. It was hard to reconcile this image of James with the man they knew, the polished benefactor who had quietly helped many but never spoke of his own battles. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "What I'm telling you isn't just about the past," she said. "It's about the man he became because of those struggles." She paused, scanning the faces before her, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Then she took a slow breath. "But what I share next," she said, "goes beyond our bond. It's about sacrifices none of you could have ever imagined." Eleanor's hands clenched tightly around her purse, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "We didn't just survive those times," she said. "We fought through them. But that fight demanded sacrifices, marks left on us both that none of you would ever see." A heaviness settled over the mourners. "In 1967, James lost his job for attending a march in Selma," Eleanor said. "The school board called it unbecoming conduct." She let out a slow breath. "But we all knew what it really was, retribution." She shook her head. "He didn't tell anyone about it, not his family, not his friends, because James never wanted pity." The murmurs had disappeared now. The weight of Eleanor's words pressed hard on the gathered crowd. He packed up what little he had and moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery, she continued. That's where he lived, scraping by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight. Eleanor's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed forward. When my own house was firebombed for hosting meetings, James was the one who came for me in the middle of the night. Gasps echoed through the group. He drove me and my two nephews to safety, she said. No hesitation, knowing full well the risk. She turned back to the casket, her expression softening. That's who James was, she said. Not the polished man in a tailored suit you all remember, but someone who walked through fire for the people he loved. The crowd stood in silence, captivated, shaken. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This, she said, holding it up, is a letter James wrote to me in 1972. She unfolded it with care, her hands shaking just enough to show how much it meant to her. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling, but clear. Eleanor, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back. Her voice broke on the last line. She paused, regaining her composure. The crowd, once filled with polite, detached mourners, now stood frozen, their expression shifting from shock to something deeper. But she wasn't done yet, because what she was about to reveal next would shake them to their core. The silence that followed Eleanor's words was deafening, heavier than the still air around them. Mourners, who had once shared polite smiles, now exchanged uneasy glances, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the one Eleanor had revealed. Some dabbed at their eyes, others looked down, ashamed that they had never bothered to ask James about his past. But Eleanor wasn't finished, and the most shocking truth was yet to come. She took a steadying breath, her hand still clutching the letter that had reduced the crowd to stunned silence. There's one more thing you all need to know, she said, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. James didn't just fight for others, he fought a battle none of you could see. The mourners tensed, bracing for whatever revelation would come next. Eleanor's eyes swept over them, as if daring someone to turn away. For years, James carried a secret, one he never spoke of, one he sacrificed everything to protect. The tension in the air thickened, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. James had a child. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by an eruption of hushed whispers. Eyes darted back and forth, confusion and disbelief flashing across their faces. James Whitmore, a man who had dedicated his life to charity, who had never married, who had lived alone for so many years, had a child. It seemed impossible. Eleanor let them murmur for a moment before she continued, her voice unwavering. His son's name is Samuel, and he's here today. The whispers stopped abruptly as all heads turned, scanning the crowd. Then, from the back, a tall man stepped forward, his presence commanding, his broad shoulders squared. Samuel was a mirror image of James in his younger years. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same sharp jawline, the same determined gaze, the same quiet strength. His presence alone silenced the crowd more effectively than any words could. He walked to Eleanor's side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, for everything. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. It was always my honor, she whispered. She turned back to the crowd, her expression soft but firm. James never spoke about Samuel because, at the time, the world wouldn't have accepted the truth. Murmurs of confusion rose again, but Eleanor pressed forward. You see, Samuel's mother, she paused, letting her gaze drift over the crowd, was a black woman. A stunned silence fell over the group, as if the very air had been stolen from their lungs. The weight of those words in that time, in that place, was not lost on anyone. Eleanor's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. In the world James lived in, having a son with a black woman would have meant losing everything: the respect of his colleagues, the ability to work, even the support of his own family. Her eyes flickered with sadness, but also a deep, unwavering conviction. But he never abandoned his son. Never once. A few mourners shifted uncomfortably, guilt settling into their bones. They had admired James for his public acts of kindness, but they had never considered the private sacrifices he had made. Eleanor wasn't here to let them forget. I was there when Samuel was born, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. And I was there when James held his son for the first time, knowing he could never publicly claim him, but loving him all the same. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't falter. James wrote letters to Samuel every week. He visited whenever he could, always in secret, always under the cover of darkness. And he made sure his son never went without. Samuel took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice strong yet filled with sorrow. "My father gave me everything he could," he said. "But more than anything, he gave me his heart. He taught me to stand tall, even when the world tried to make me invisible." His gaze moved across the stunned faces of the mourners. And yet, how many of you knew he had a son at all? No one spoke. The shame in the air was palpable. Eleanor sighed, the exhaustion of years pressing into her bones. James didn't hide Samuel because he was ashamed. He hid him because he had to. She took another breath before continuing. He was trying to protect him from a world that would have judged him before knowing him, from people who would have tried to erase him. The realization hit hard. Many of the mourners had admired James for his philanthropy, for his carefully curated image of kindness, but they had never truly seen him. They had never known the depth of his struggles, the weight of his sacrifices, the pain of having to love his own son in secret. An older man near the front of the group cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. I never knew," he stammered. James never said a word about any of this. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at him. "He wasn't the kind of man to seek praise for doing what was right," she said. "But make no mistake, he carried the weight of these sacrifices every single day." A middle-aged woman, her face streaked with tears, stepped forward hesitantly. "I remember him helping my family when my father lost his job," she said quietly. "I thought I understood his kindness, but now it feels so much deeper." Eleanor nodded, her voice filled with quiet strength. James didn't just give because he had the means. He gave because he knew what it meant to go without, and he never wanted anyone else to feel that same pain. The crowd began to stir, fragments of their own memories of James bubbling to the surface. Each story shared painted a picture of a man whose generosity and strength were rooted in a life few of them had truly understood. Samuel stepped forward once more, his voice low but firm. "My father always told me that the measure of a person isn't what they leave behind in things," he said. "It's what they leave behind in people." He looked around, his eyes filled with quiet intensity. "And standing here today, I see that he left behind more than I ever imagined." The crowd exhaled collectively, the emotional weight giving way to quiet reflection. Tears fell freely, not just for James' passing, but for the profound realization of his unseen sacrifices. Eleanor placed her hand on the polished headstone, her voice softer now but no less resolute. "So now I leave you with this," she said. "How will you be remembered? Not for the things you had or the title you earned, but for the lives you touched and the love you gave." She turned back to the crowd, her expression kind but firm. If James taught us anything, it's that true legacy isn't written in stone. It's written in the hearts of the people you lift up. A long silence followed, the weight of her words settling into the hearts of everyone present. Some nodded quietly, others wiped away tears, and a few simply stood still, lost in thought. Eleanor gave a final nod to Samuel before stepping back, letting the moment settle. The mourners began to disperse, but something had shifted, not just in how they saw James, but in how they saw themselves. Willow Hill Cemetery had been a place of finality that day, but James Whitmore's story didn't end here, because his real legacy had only just begun. We live in a world where people are often judged by what they show, not by what they endure. We admire those who appear successful, generous, and kind, but how often do we stop to ask, what did it cost them to be this way? The story of James Whitmore is a powerful reminder that true greatness is rarely loud, it is often quiet, hidden in the sacrifices that go unnoticed, in the love that is given without expectation of recognition. James was a man who gave his life to others, who fought battles no one knew about, who carried burdens in silence, because he believed doing what was right was more important than being praised for it. He lost his job, his security, and his place in the world to stand for justice. He kept his love for his son hidden, not because he was ashamed, but because the world wasn't ready to accept it. He didn't talk about his struggles, but he made sure that others didn't have to suffer the same way. That is true selflessness. But here's the real question. How many of us truly see the sacrifices of those around us? How often do we assume we know someone's story, when in reality, we've only seen a fraction of it? James was celebrated for the life people saw, but it took a woman named Eleanor and a son named Samuel to show the world who he truly was. And when that truth was finally spoken, it changed everything. There's a lesson in that for all of us. How many people in your life have given up something for you that you never realized? A parent who worked late nights so you could have a better future. A teacher who believed in you when no one else did. A friend who stood by your side when they had every reason to walk away. These are the people who shape our lives, not through words, but through sacrifices made in the shadows. James' story forces us to ask ourselves, what will we be remembered for? Not the titles we held, not the money we made, but the lives we touched. Will we be the kind of people who give, who fight for what's right, who love fiercely even when no one is watching? Because in the end, the legacy that truly matters isn't built on wealth or status, it's built on love, courage, and the quiet sacrifices we make for others. So today, take a moment. See people, truly see them. Appreciate those who have given without asking for anything in return. And most importantly, live in a way that, when your time comes, the world will remember you not for what you had, but for how deeply you loved and how boldly you gave.